Please, we must save him. He cannot die. We must save him. Bring the oxygen. Let's save his life first.
The surgical blade trembled in Dr. Ngozi's hand as another contraction ripped through her swollen belly. But she couldn't stop now because the billionaire bleeding out on her operating table was going to die in the next 4 minutes if she didn't clamp the severed hepatic artery that was pumping his life away with every heartbeat. The monitors screamed their warnings as Emeka Okoro's blood pressure dropped to dangerous levels, his pale lips turning blue under the harsh operating room lights, while Ngozi's own baby kicked violently against a ribcage as if trying to escape the nightmare unfolding in Lagos General Hospital's trauma unit. She had been 37 weeks pregnant when they wheeled this man into her OR at 3 in the morning, and now, 6 hours into the most complex surgery of her career, her water had just broken, soaking through her surgical gown and pooling on the floor beneath her feet. The nurses gasped. The anesthesiologist's eyes went wide with panic, but Ngozi just gritted her teeth and steadied her hand because she had spent 10 years training to be a surgeon, and she would be damned if some oil tycoon died on her watch just because a baby decided today was moving day. If you think that's intense, wait until you hear what happens when she discovers who this man really is. So make sure you'll subscribe and hit that notification bell because this story is about to get wild. Ngozi had seen plenty of trauma cases during her residency at Lagos General, but nothing compared to the mangled mess of internal injuries that Emeka Okoro had sustained when a pipeline exploded at his oil facility in Port Harcourt just 8 hours ago. His company's private jet had rushed him to Lagos because he needed a vascular surgeon with enough skill to repair the damage, and fate had cruelly decided that Ngozi would be the only qualified surgeon on call that night. She remembered the moment they wheeled him in. His expensive suit torn and blood-soaked, his face covered in soot and cuts, his designer watch still glinting on his wrist even as his life drained away. The paramedics had shouted something about him being Emeka Okoro, the Emeka Okoro, founder of Okoro Petroleum Industries, one of the richest men in Nigeria, but Ngozi hadn't cared about his bank account when his spleen was ruptured and his liver was shredded like confetti. She had simply scrubbed in, pushed aside the exhaustion of her 3rd trimester, and got into work saving a stranger's life while her own body prepared to bring new life into the world. The pain hit her again, stronger this time, a wave of agony that made her vision blur and her knees buckle, but she locked her legs and forced herself to focus on the surgical field because this man's inferior vena cava was hanging by a thread and one wrong move would flood his chest cavity with blood. Her assisting resident, Dr. Chidi Okafor, looked at her with genuine fear in his eyes and whispered that she needed to step away, that they should call in Dr. Adeyemi from his vacation, that she was going into active labor and needed to prioritize her baby. Ngozi ignored him and tied off another bleeder with hands that had steadied through sheer force of will, because she knew that Dr. Adeyemi was 4 hours away in Abuja, and this patient had maybe 30 minutes left if they were lucky. She could feel the pressure building in her pelvis, the unmistakable sensation of her cervix dilating, her body betraying her at the worst possible moment. The head nurse, Mama Joy, had already called for an obstetrics team to stand by outside the OR, ready to catch Ngozi's baby if it decided to make an appearance before she finished saving this billionaire's life. Something about the man's face kept nagging at Ngozi as she worked, some familiar quality she couldn't quite place through the blood and bruising, but she pushed the thought aside because she needed to focus on repairing the damage to his diaphragm before his lung collapsed completely. She worked with mechanical precision, her training taking over even as her body screamed at her to stop, to lie down, to push, to give birth. Sweat poured down her face behind her surgical mask, mixing with tears of pain and frustration, but her hands remained steady as she placed stitch after perfect stitch. Dr. Chidi kept glancing at the clock, then at her belly, then back at the patient, clearly torn between his duty to assist her and his instinct to drag her out of the OR before she gave birth standing up. The anesthesiologist, Dr. Benson, had started timing her contractions and announced they were coming every 3 minutes now, which meant she was definitely in active labor and should have been in the delivery room an hour ago. At hour 8 of the surgery, when Ngozi thought she might actually die from the pain radiating through her back and abdomen, she finally tied off the last bleeder and stepped back from the table with shaking legs and a sense of accomplishment that was immediately overshadowed by another massive contraction. Emeka Okoro's vitals were stabilizing, his blood pressure climbing back toward normal, his oxygen saturation improving as his repaired lung inflated properly, and Ngozi felt a surge of triumph that lasted exactly 5 seconds before her vision went dark and her knees gave out completely. She heard Mama Joy scream her name, felt strong hands catching her before she hit the floor. so the ceiling tile spinning above her as they lowered her onto a gurney that someone had rushed into the OR. The last thing she remembered before everything went black was Dr. Chidi's voice shouting for the obstetrics team, and the bizarre thought that the man she had just saved looked exactly like the stranger who had gotten her pregnant 9 months ago in a Port Harcourt hotel room. But that was impossible because that man had been kind and gentle and had left her a note saying she deserved better. Not a billionaire oil tycoon who probably didn't even remember the broken-hearted woman he had. Comforted for one night. Don't go anywhere, because when Ngozi wakes up, she's about to discover a truth that will shatter her entire world. Comment below if you think this billionaire is really the father, and let's see who's paying attention. Chapter 2 is coming up next. Ngozi opened her eyes to fluorescent lights and the sound of a baby crying, and for one disorienting moment she thought she was still in the operating room, until the pain in her abdomen reminded her that she had given birth, though she had absolutely no memory of the delivery or how long she had been unconscious. A nurse whose name tag read Sister Blessing smiled down at her and explained that Ngozi had delivered a healthy baby girl through emergency cesarean section after collapsing in the OR, and that both mother and baby were doing fine despite the dramatic circumstances of the birth. Ngozi's first instinct was to ask about her patient, the billionaire with the shredded liver, and Sister Blessing's smile widened as she reported that Amaka Okoro was stable and recovering in the ICU, already awake and asking questions about the surgeon who had saved his life. The relief that flooded through Ngozi was so intense it brought tears to her eyes, but then Sister Blessing said something that made her blood run cold. Amaka Okoro's mother was outside the recovery room and desperately wanted to speak with her about something urgent. The woman who swept into Ngozi's room 30 minutes later was a picture Nigerian elegance, draped in expensive Ankara fabric and gold jewelry that probably cost more than Ngozi's annual salary, her hair wrapped in an elaborate jewel that added 6 inches to her height and an air of regal authority to her already commanding presence. Mama Okoro introduced herself with a warmth that seemed genuine, clasped Ngozi's hand with surprising gentleness, and thanked her repeatedly for saving her son's life in a voice thick with emotion and gratitude. But then her expression shifted into something more complex, a mixture of confusion and recognition that made Ngozi's stomach clench with undefined dread. Mama Okoro pulled out her phone with hands that trembled slightly, swiped to a photo, and held it up to Ngozi's face with a question in her eyes that seemed to carry the weight of the entire universe. The photo showed a woman sleeping peacefully in a hotel bed, her face relaxed and vulnerable, her hair spread across a white pillow, and Ngozi's heart stopped beating for several seconds because that woman was her. And this photo had been taken 9 months ago on the worst night of her life. Ngozi's mind raced backward through time to that horrible evening in Port Harcourt when she had discovered her fiancé Tobias in bed with her best friend Kyoma, the two of them naked and laughing until they saw her standing in the doorway with a surprise birthday cake she had spent hours baking. She remembered running from that apartment with tears streaming down her face, remembered ending up at a hotel bar where she had drunk too much wine too quickly, remembered a kind stranger with gentle eyes who had listened to her sob story without judgment or expectation. They had talked for hours about betrayal and heartbreak and the cruelty of people we trust, and somewhere around midnight the talking had turned to touching, and the touching had led them to his hotel room where they had spent one perfect night tangled in sheets and each other. He had made her feel beautiful and wanted and worthy when everything in her world felt broken and wrong, but he had left before dawn with only a handwritten note on hotel stationery that said she deserved better than the man who had cheated on her. Ngozi had never even learned his name, had deliberately avoided asking because she wanted that night to remain a beautiful memory untainted by the complications of real life. But now Mama Okoro was showing her a photo that the stranger had apparently taken while she slept, which meant he had kept it for 9 months, which meant he had thought about her, which meant that night had mattered to him too. And oh God, this woman was Amaka Okoro's mother, which meant the billionaire oil tycoon recovering in the ICU was the same kind stranger who had held her while she cried and made love to her with such tenderness she had almost believed in goodness again. Ngozi's hand started shaking so badly that Sister Blessing rushed over to check her vitals, but Ngozi waved her away because what she needed wasn't medical attention, but rather an explanation for how the universe could be so impossibly cruel as to put her in the position of saving the life of the man who had gotten her pregnant and then disappeared. Mema Okoro seemed to read the confirmation in Ngozi's face because her eyes filled with tears and she pulled Ngozi into a fierce hug, whispering that she knew, and that God had brought them all together for a reason. The old woman explained that Amaka had been carrying this photo on his damaged phone for months, that he had been searching hospitals and medical conferences all over Nigeria trying to find the mysterious doctor he had met that night, that he had never stopped thinking about her even after the industrial accident that had given him partial amnesia. The mention of amnesia made Ngozi's blood run cold because it raised a question that she almost couldn't bear to ask, but Mama Okoro was already answering with sad eyes and a gentle voice that confirmed Ngozi's worst fear. Amaka had no memory of that night in Port Harcourt. The brain injury from his first accident had stolen those hours from his mind, and the only proof that it had even happened was a photo on his recovered phone and the vague sense that he had met someone important. He had been having dreams about a woman with kind eyes and a sad smile, fragments of memories that felt more like wishes than reality, and he had convinced himself that she was someone he needed to find even though he couldn't remember why. Mema Okoro reached out and placed one weathered hand on Ngozi's still swollen belly, then gestured toward a bassinet when Ngozi's newborn daughter slept peacefully, and stated what they both already knew. This baby was Amaka's child, conceived on that night of passion and pain, carried for 9 months by a woman who had no idea she was bearing a billionaire's heir. The implications crashed over Ngozi like a tsunami, drowning her in questions about what happened next, about whether she should tell Amaka the truth, about whether he would even believe her if she did. Before Ngozi could formulate a response to this impossible situation, the recovery room door burst open and a man in an expensive suit strode in with a kind of aggressive confidence that immediately set Ngozi's teeth on edge. He introduced himself as Marcus Jubum, Amaka Okoro's business partner and acting CEO of Okoro Petroleum Industries, while Amaka recovered from his injuries, and his smile didn't reach his eyes as he assessed Ngozi with a cold calculation of someone evaluating a potential threat. Marcus thanked Ngozi effusively for saving his partner's life, but something in his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased that she had succeeded, and when he asked Mama Okoro if they could speak privately about urgent company business, the old woman's face hardened with obvious dislike. Marcus waited until Mama Okoro reluctantly left the room before turning to Ngozi with a smile that had sharpened into something predatory, and then he dropped a folder on her hospital bed containing printouts of her social media posts, her medical school transcripts, her financial records, and several photos of her entering and leaving the Port Harcourt Hotel 9 months ago. He said he had done his research on the doctor who had so conveniently been in the right place at the right time to save Amaka's life, and he had discovered some very interesting facts about her pregnancy timeline and her financial struggles as a resident doctor, and wouldn't it be terrible if certain people started to believe she had deliberately gotten pregnant by a billionaire and then orchestrated this entire situation to trap him. The trap is set, but who's really the predator here? Drop a comment if you saw this twist coming, and don't you dare leave before Chapter 3 because Marcus's game is just getting started. Hit that like button if you're as angry as I am right now. Ngozi stared at Marcus Jubum with a fury so intense she could taste it like copper in her mouth, because this smug predator in an expensive suit was standing in her hospital room barely 12 hours after she had nearly died bringing a child into the world, threatening to destroy her reputation with lies and manufactured evidence that would paint her as a gold digger who had trapped a billionaire. Her voice came out low and deadly when she told him to get out of her room before she called security, but Marcus just laughed and settled into the visitor's chair like he owned the place, crossing his legs and adjusting his cufflinks with theatrical casualty that made it clear he wasn't going anywhere. He explained in excruciating detail how easy it would be to spin a narrative about a struggling doctor who deliberately seduced a wealthy man, tracked his movements, and then positioned herself to be his surgeon during a crisis, or to secure a financial future through child support and potential inheritance. The media would eat up a story like that, Marcus said with obvious relish, and even if the accusations were never proven, the stain on her medical career would be permanent because hospitals didn't employ doctors whose judgment could be questioned in such spectacular fashion. But Marcus wasn't here just to threaten her. He continued, because he was actually offering her a way out of this messy situation, a solution that would benefit everyone involved and allow her to maintain her dignity and career. He pulled out a thick legal document from his briefcase and laid it on the bed beside the folder of evidence, explaining that this was a contract that would provide Ngozi with a generous settlement in exchange for her agreement to relinquish all parental rights to her daughter and never contact Amaka Okoro or his family again. The number he mentioned made Ngozi's breath catch despite her rage, because it was more money than she would earn in 5 years as a surgeon, enough to pay off her medical school debts and set herself up comfortably anywhere in Nigeria or even abroad. Marcus sweetened the deal by offering to arrange a prestigious fellowship for her in a hospital far from Lagos, somewhere she could start fresh without the complications of a billionaire baby daddy interfering with her life and career. All she had to do was sign the papers, take her daughter, accept the money, and disappear before Amaka woke up and started asking questions about the surgeon who had saved his life. The proposition was so outrageous that Ngozi actually laughed, a sound with no humor in it whatsoever, because this fool seemed to genuinely believe she would sell her child like merchandise just to avoid some manufactured scandal. She told Marcus exactly where he could shove his contract and his money, using language that would have shocked her medical school professors, but felt absolutely appropriate for the situation at hand. But Marcus's smile never wavered as he leaned forward and dropped his real bomb, explaining that he wasn't actually asking for her cooperation because he already had something much more valuable than her consent. He revealed that he had been the one who caused Amaka's first accident 3 months ago, the industrial explosion that had given Amaka his traumatic brain injury and convenient amnesia, because Marcus had been systematically sabotaging the company's operations to drive down stock prices and position himself to take over as CEO. Amaka's recovery from that first accident had been inconveniently rapid, so Marcus had arranged his second accident to finish the job, but somehow the stubborn bastard had survived again thanks to Ngozi's surgical skills. Now Marcus found himself in a delicate position, he admitted with shocking casualness, because he couldn't exactly arrange a third accident without raising serious suspicions, but he also couldn't allow Amaka to fully recover and reclaim control of his company. So Marcus had developed a new plan, one that was admittedly more complicated but potentially more effective. He would use Ngozi and her baby as leverage to keep Amaka distracted and emotionally compromised, unable to focus on business while dealing with the shocking revelation that he had fathered a child he couldn't remember conceiving. Marcus would position himself as Amaka's loyal friend, helping him navigate this personal crisis, all while continuing to consolidate power within Okoro Petroleum Industries, and by the time Amaka figured out what was happening, Marcus would control enough of the company's assets and board votes to push him out entirely. And if Ngozi refused to cooperate with this plan, well, Marcus had already prepared evidence suggesting that she had been involved in planning both accidents, desperate to create a situation where she could insert herself into Amaka's life as a savior and the mother of his child. Ngozi felt genuine fear for the first time since this nightmare began, because Marcus Jubum was clearly a man with no moral boundaries and enough resources to make his threats very real, and she had a newborn baby to protect now, so she couldn't just dismiss him as a standard corporate sociopath. She tried to calculate her options while Marcus watched her with those cold eyes that seemed to enjoy her distress, but every path forward seemed blocked by his preparations and manipulations. If she told Amaka the truth about being the father of her child, Marcus would unleash a smear campaign and potentially implicate her in the accidents. If she stayed silent and tried to disappear, Marcus would track her down because he needed her as a chess piece in his game against Amaka. If she went to the police with Marcus's confession, he would simply deny everything and deploy his manufactured evidence against her, and who would believe a struggling resident doctor over a successful businessman with political connections? The trap Marcus had constructed was brilliant in its cruelty, designed to ensure that no matter what choice Ngozi made, he would benefit from the chaos. But then the door opened again and Mama Okoro walked back in with an expression that suggested she had been listening at the door and heard every word of Marcus's threats, and the old woman's face had transformed into something fierce and terrifying that reminded Ngozi that successful Nigerian mothers didn't raise billionaire sons by being gentle and naive. Mama Okoro told Marcus to leave her daughter-in-law's room immediately, and the term daughter-in-law hung in the air like a grenade because it implied claims and connections that Marcus clearly hadn't anticipated in his calculations. Marcus stood up smoothly and gathered his papers, but his smile had developed a nervous edge as Mama Okoro advanced on him with a kind of quiet fury that was somehow more frightening than screaming would have been. The old woman informed Marcus that she had recorded his entire confession on her phone, that she had already sent the audio file to her lawyer and her pastor and 3 journalist friends, and that if anything happened to her son or to Ngozi or to her granddaughter, that recording would be released to every media outlet in Nigeria within the hour. Marcus's face went pale beneath his expensive grooming, and for the first time since entering the room, he looked genuinely worried about the situation he had created for himself. Three days after the confrontation with Marcus Jubum, Ngozi sat beside Amaka Okoro's hospital bed watching him sleep, and trying to decide whether she hated him or loved him or some impossible combination of both, because the situation had become exponentially more complicated since Mama Okoro's recording had forced Marcus to back off temporarily. Amaka had been moved from the ICU to a private suite that probably cost more per night than Ngozi's monthly rent, and he had been awake and alert for the past 48 hours, charming the nurses and making business calls and acting like he hadn't almost died on her operating table. He had thanked Ngozi profusely for saving his life, had asked her gentle questions about her pregnancy and her baby, had seemed genuinely interested in her career and her plans for the future, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her deeply uncomfortable, some quality of recognition that shouldn't have been possible for a man who supposedly didn't remember their night together. Mama Okoro had been visiting constantly, bringing Ngozi home-cooked meals and baby clothes and unsolicited advice about raising a child, treating her like family even though Ngozi had made it clear she wasn't ready to tell Amaka the truth about his daughter. But this morning everything had changed when Ngozi arrived for her daily check on Amaka's recovery and found him sitting up in bed looking at his phone with an expression she couldn't quite read, some mixture of triumph and guilt that made her stomach drop with undefined dread. He looked up when she entered, and instead of his usual friendly greeting, he simply held up his phone to show her the same photo his mother had shown her days earlier, the picture of Ngozi sleeping in that Port Harcourt hotel room 9 months ago. His voice was quiet when he asked if she recognized the woman in the photo, and Ngozi's heart started pounding so hard she thought it might actually burst through her chest because there was something knowing in his tone that suggested he already knew the answer. She admitted that yes, that was her, and she waited for him to ask the obvious questions about their connection and his potential paternity, but instead Amaka smiled and said something that made her entire world tilt sideways. He remembered everything about that night, every conversation and touch in whispered confidence, and he had been lying about his amnesia since the moment he woke up after surgery. Ngozi stood frozen in the doorway trying to process this impossible confession, because if Amaka remembered their night together, then he had been playing some kind of elaborate game since regaining consciousness, pretending not to know her while watching her squirm with the secret of his paternity. Her voice came out strangled when she asked why. Why would he lie about something so fundamental? And Amaka had the decency to look ashamed as he explained his reasoning. He said that after his first accident and during his recovery, he had become paranoid about people's motivations, about who genuinely cared for him versus who just wanted access to his wealth and power. And when he woke up after the second surgery to find that the doctor who saved him was the same woman from that night, he had decided to test her. He wanted to see if she would tell him about their encounter and her pregnancy voluntarily, if she would try to claim his child and his money, or if she would keep quiet out of genuine integrity and respect for his supposed memory loss. It had been a cruel test, he admitted, but given Marcus's obvious scheming and the constant attempts by various people to take advantage of his vulnerable position, he had felt it was necessary to know who he could trust. The anger that exploded through Ngozi was white-hot and all-consuming, because this man had let her agonize for days about whether to tell him he was a father, had watched her struggle with impossible decisions about her daughter's future, had allowed her to be threatened by Marcus without stepping in to help, all because he wanted to test her character like she was some job applicant rather than a human being who had saved his life. She told him exactly what she thought of his trust issues and his manipulation and his billionaire paranoia, using her outdoor voice and not caring when nurses poked their heads in to see what the shouting was about. Amaka tried to interrupt, to explain, to apologize, but Ngozi was on a roll now, listing every way he had failed as a human being and future father, pointing out that his money didn't give him the right to treat people like pawns in his psychological experiments. She informed him that his daughter, yes, that was his baby she had delivered while saving his ungrateful life, would be raised without him because she refused to let a manipulative liar anywhere near her child, and she didn't care how much money he had or how sorry he claimed to be. He had proven himself unworthy of being anyone's father. The devastation on Amaka's face might have softened Ngozi's rage if she hadn't been so absolutely furious, because he clearly hadn't expected this reaction, had somehow convinced himself that his confession would be received with understanding rather than fury. He scrambled out of bed despite his healing injuries, trying to reach for her, trying to explain that he had only been protecting himself, that he had fallen for her during that one night in Port Harcourt and had been searching for her desperately ever since, that waking up to find she was a surgeon had felt like fate giving him a second chance. But Ngozi stepped back from his reaching hand because she could see the pattern now, could recognize the same kind of manipulation her ex-fiancé Tobias had used, the way powerful men justified their selfishness by claiming they were protecting themselves or testing loyalty or making sure someone's love was real. She told Amaka that if he had genuinely cared about her, he would have been honest from the moment he woke up, would have trusted her enough to tell the truth instead of staging elaborate tests of her character. The fact that he had chosen manipulation over honesty told her everything she needed to know about what kind of partner and father he would be. But then Mama Okoro appeared in the doorway looking grave and worried, and she had brought someone with her who made both Ngozi and Amaka freeze in shock, Marcus Jubum, who was bleeding from a cut above his eye and looking genuinely terrified for the first time since Ngozi had met him. And he was babbling about attempts on his life and frame jobs and needing protection from whoever was actually behind the accidents at Okoro Petroleum Industries. Marcus claimed that he had lied about causing the explosions, that he had only said those things to scare Ngozi into cooperation, but now someone was trying to kill him and make it look like suicide, and he had nowhere else to turn because Amaka was the only person powerful enough to protect him. The confession came out in a panicked rush. Marcus had been investigating the accidents independently and had discovered evidence of systematic sabotage going back months, long before Amaka's first injury. And the real perpetrator was someone inside the company with access to operational systems and safety protocols. Marcus had made the mistake of confronting this person with his evidence, and now he was running for his life because whoever was behind this wasn't playing games anymore. They were eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. The person who walked into Amaka's hospital room behind Marcus and Mama Okoro was the last human being Ngozi ever expected to see again, and her brain actually refused to process the reality of her ex-fiancé Tobias standing there with a confident smile, wearing an Okoro Petroleum Industry security badge clipped to his designer suit. Tobias greeted Ngozi like they were old friends who had simply lost touch, asking about her pregnancy and congratulating her on her successful surgery, completely ignoring the fact that she had caught him in bed with her best friend less than a year ago and hadn't spoken to him since. He turned to Amaka with professional courtesy and explained that he was a new head of corporate security for Okoro Petroleum Industries, hired 3 months ago to investigate the suspicious accidents plaguing the company's operations, and he had finally traced the sabotage back to its source after weeks of careful investigation. Marcus, Tobias announced with theatrical gravity, had been the mastermind all along, creating false trails and manipulating evidence to cover his tracks. And the cut above Marcus's eye wasn't from an assassination attempt, but rather from a fight with security guards when they caught him trying to delete incriminating files from the company's servers. But something about Tobias's explanation felt wrong to Ngozi, some quality in his voice that reminded her of all the times he had lied to her during their relationship, and when she looked at Marcus's terrified face she saw genuine confusion rather than the anger of someone whose plans had been exposed. Ngozi's instincts as a doctor had been honed by years of reading people in crisis situations, and every fiber of her being was screaming that Tobias was lying with the same smooth confidence he had used to hide his affair with Kyoma. She interrupted Tobias's presentation to ask how he had ended up working for Okoro Petroleum Industries, because the last she knew he had been a low-level manager at a logistics company in Port Harcourt, and his jump to head of security at one of Nigeria's largest corporations seemed impossibly convenient. Tobias's smile tightened fractionally, and he explained that he had been recruited through a professional network, but something in his eyes told Ngozi he was improvising this answer, making it up as he went along because he hadn't expected to be questioned by someone who knew his history of dishonesty. Amaka, who had been quiet since Tobias's entrance, suddenly sat up straight in his hospital bed, and his voice had gone cold and dangerous when he asked Tobias to explain something that didn't make sense in his timeline of events. If Marcus had been sabotaging operations for months, why had Tobias only been hired 3 months ago, after the first major accident that had given Amaka his supposed amnesia, and why hadn't any of Tobias's security measures prevented the second explosion that had nearly killed Amaka 3 days ago? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Ngozi watched Tobias's confident facade start to crack under Amaka's intense scrutiny, because clearly the billionaire hadn't survived in the cutthroat oil industry by being naive or easy to manipulate. Tobias tried to deflect with technical jargon about security protocols and investigation timelines, but Mama Okoro interrupted him with a question that made everyone in the room go silent. Why had Tobias been visiting the Port Harcourt hotel where Amaka and Ngozi had their encounter, checking in under a false name on the same night they were there? And why did security footage show him entering and exiting Amaka's room, while Amaka was passed out drunk in Ngozi's room? The explosion of revelations that followed made Ngozi's head spin, because apparently Mama Okoro had been conducting her own investigation with the help of private detectives and a mother's intuition that something was seriously wrong with the accidents targeting her son. Tobias had been stalking Ngozi after their breakup, had followed her to Port Harcourt that night 9 months ago, had watched her pick up a stranger at the hotel bar and disappear into his room, and had decided to take revenge by drugging Amaka's drink hours later when Amaka returned to his own room. The drug was supposed to cause a fatal reaction when mixed with alcohol, but Amaka's system had metabolized it differently, leaving him alive but disoriented enough to crash his car the next morning, resulting in a traumatic brain injury that had caused his partial amnesia. Tobias had then manipulated his way into a security position at Okoro Petroleum Industries by claiming expertise in investigating industrial sabotage, allowing him access to operational systems and the ability to cause a second explosion while making it look like Marcus's doing. His endgame had been to eliminate Amaka, frame Marcus, and eventually position himself to embezzle from the company during the chaos of leadership transition, but he hadn't counted on Ngozi being the surgeon who saved Amaka's life or Mama Okoro being suspicious enough to investigate independently. Tobias's face had gone from confident to cornered, and Ngozi saw him reach for something in his jacket pocket with a speed that suggested the situation was about to turn violent. But Marcus moved faster than anyone expected for a corporate executive, tackling Tobias to the ground before he could draw whatever weapon he had been reaching for. The hospital room erupted into chaos as nurses came running. Security guards appeared, and Mima Okoro was shouting into her phone for the police while simultaneously videoing everything on her phone as evidence. Ngozi found herself being pulled back against Amaka's hospital bed, his arms wrapped around her protectively even though he was the one who was supposed to be recovering from life-threatening injuries, and she could feel his heart pounding against her back as they watched Tobias being restrained and arrested. In the aftermath, when police had taken Tobias away and Marcus was being treated for his minor injuries and giving his statement about months of being framed for crimes he didn't commit, Ngozi and Amaka finally had a moment alone in the chaos-torn hospital room to address the enormous truth that still hung between them. Amaka spoke first, his voice rough with emotion as he apologized again for lying about his amnesia, for testing her loyalty, for not trusting her enough to be honest about remembering their night together. He explained that his paranoia had been justified in some ways because Tobias had been systematically destroying his life, but that didn't excuse him manipulating Ngozi when she had done nothing but save him and carry his child without asking anything in return. Ngozi listened to his apology and felt her rage softening into something more complicated, because she understood fear and betrayal and the ways trauma could make people build walls around their hearts, but she also knew that forgiveness wasn't something she could offer immediately just because the real villain had been caught. She told Amaka that she needed time to figure out if she could trust him, that their daughter deserved a father who would be honest and present and emotionally available, not someone who played mind games whenever he felt threatened. Amaka nodded slowly, tears actually forming in his eyes, and he asked if he could at least meet his daughter properly, hold her once, know her name before Ngozi made any final decisions about his role in their lives. The vulnerability in his request pierced through Ngozi's defenses because this was the same gentle man who had held her on the worst night of her life, who had made her feel worthy and beautiful when everything seemed broken, and maybe that man was still somewhere inside the paranoid billionaire who had tested her loyalty. Mema Okoro brought the baby into the room wrapped in a soft pink blanket, and Ngozi watched Amaka's face transform with wonder as he held his daughter for the first time, counting her tiny fingers and marveling at her perfect features with a kind of awe that couldn't be faked or manipulated. The baby opened her eyes and seemed to study her father's face with infant wisdom, and something shifted in the hospital room, some recognition between father and daughter that made Ngozi's heart ache with the possibility of what they could become as a family. Amaka whispered that he wanted to be better, to earn Ngozi's trust and his daughter's love, to prove that he could be the man they deserved instead of the damaged billionaire who pushed people away with tests and suspicion. He suggested they start over, slowly, with honesty this time, maybe with coffee dates and supervised visits and therapy to work through the trauma and paranoia that had nearly destroyed their chance at happiness. Ngozi found herself agreeing, cautiously hopeful, because everyone deserved a second chance at love, especially when there was a beautiful baby girl who needed both her parents to figure out how to be better people together. 6 months later, Ngozi stood in the garden of Amaka's Lagos estate watching him play with their daughter, who had grown into a chunky, happy baby with her father's smile and her mother's determined personality, and she felt something close to contentment for the first time since this whole crazy journey began. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy or simple, because Amaka had needed months of therapy to work through his trust issues, and Ngozi had needed time to forgive his manipulation, and they had both needed to learn how to communicate honestly instead of protecting themselves with lies and silence. But somewhere between the awkward coffee dates and the couple's counseling sessions and the late-night diaper changes they shared, they had fallen in love properly this time, with full knowledge of each other's flaws and fears and capacity for both cruelty and kindness. Marcus had been promoted to genuine CEO of Okoro Petroleum Industries after helping expose Tobias's crimes, and he had actually apologized to Ngozi for his initial threats, explaining that he had been paranoid and desperate, though he maintained he would have never actually carried through with blackmailing her. Tobias was serving a 10-year sentence for attempted murder and corporate sabotage, and Kyoma had apparently moved to Ghana to escape the scandal, and Ngozi felt absolutely no satisfaction in her downfall because she was too busy being happy with the life she had built. Amaka looked up from where he was making ridiculous faces at their daughter and caught Ngozi watching them with soft eyes, and his smile was the same one he had given her in that Port Harcourt hotel bar when she had been broken-hearted and desperate for kindness. He walked over with their baby balanced on his hip and pulled Ngozi close with his free arm, kissing her forehead with a kind of tender reverence that still made her breath catch after all these months. He whispered that he had something important to ask her, and before Ngozi could prepare herself, he was actually kneeling in the garden with their daughter giggling in his arms, pulling out a ring box that made Ngozi's heart stop and restart in quick succession. The proposal was simple and honest in everything their relationship had become. He loved her. He wanted to spend his life proving he deserved her trust, and would she please marry him so they could be a proper family for this beautiful girl who had brought them together through the most dramatic circumstances imaginable. Ngozi said yes through tears of joy because this man had seen her at her absolute worst, and she had saved him at his most vulnerable, and if that wasn't a foundation for a lasting love, then nothing was. The wedding happened 3 months later in a ceremony that mixed traditional Igbo customs with modern elegance, attended by hospital colleagues and oil industry executives and family members who were thrilled to see both Amaka and Ngozi finally happy after so much pain and chaos. Mama Okoro cried through the entire ceremony, alternating between thanking God for bringing her daughter-in-law into their lives and offering unsolicited advice about how to raise children properly, and Ngozi had grown to love the old woman's interference because it came from genuine affection. Dr. Chidi served as Ngozi's man of honor because he had been there through all the drama, and he gave a speech about how Ngozi had taught him that true strength meant saving lives even when your own world was falling apart. Marcus gave a surprisingly emotional toast about second chances and the importance of trusting your instincts, even when paranoia seemed justified, and everyone agreed that his near-death experience had actually made him a better human being. As Ngozi danced with her new husband under strings of lights with their daughter sleeping peacefully nearby, she reflected on how one terrible night and one act of kindness had led to surgical tables and conspiracy and almost unbearable pain before finally delivering her to this moment of perfect happiness, and she decided that maybe the universe wasn't cruel after all, just extremely dramatic in how it brought soulmates together, and that how a one-night stand turned into the most dramatic love story in Lagos. Drop a comment telling me which twist shocked you the most, and if you love this story, hit that subscribe button because I got more emotional roller coasters coming your way. Shay, this was someone who loves a good redemption story, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, sometimes the worst nights of our lives are actually setting us up for the best chapters we never saw coming.